Glorious devotees, thank you for attending another presentation on Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī's Six Sandarbhas. We will continue today with our discussion, and we will be going into the Ontology section, or what is the knowable. So up to this point, Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī has established what is the best means of knowing, the Praman, as Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, and from Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, the understandings presented in Śrīmad Bhāgavatam light up the whole corpus of transcendental literature that's available, even what's provided in the Vedas themselves, which we went over, is at this point, for the most part, extinct. We only have 6% of the Vedas available to us at this time. Of course, we went over a very detailed discussion for a whole presentation of the fact that such knowledge is not just for our intellectual satisfaction. It's Sabda Brahman. Itself contains spiritual potency. As Guru Maharaj likes to say, it has its agenda, and we are on its agenda, as opposed to typical acquisition of knowledge within the material world, where we simply use knowledge for our own purposes. So our discussion today is going to begin with a look at the methodology that Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī uses in the presentation of his Six Sandarbhas. Then our discussion will go into actually the knowable, the prameya, which is, as he's already presented, sambandha, abhideya, and prayojan. He's already told us that his source of knowledge is going to be primarily the Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, and how is he going to extract from the Śrīmad Bhāgavatam essential points of philosophy to school us in the sambandha, the abhideya, and the prayojan as they're presented in this great Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, the Bhagavat Purana. So we will begin there today. How is this going to be accomplished? So, the methodology of the Six Sandarbhas. This brief section, consisting of just 2 anuchedas, and just as a reminder, an anucheda is a section. The word basically would translate as section. And in each section, or anucheda, Śrīla Jīva presents an idea, and that idea fortifies an overall theme, and the 3 overriding themes are sambandha, abhideya, and prayojan. The first theme of sambandha is presented comprehensively in the first 4 sandarbhas. This brief section is imperative for understanding Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī's strategy for analyzing Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, which he has already established as his praman in the matter of the self-disclosure of ultimate reality. It informs us of the manner by which the author has arrived at his conclusions throughout the Six Sandarbhas. So, we come to this 27th anucheda, and the first part of it reads as follows. So it is that we shall focus our investigation specifically on Śrīmad Bhāgavatam to determine, free of any inconsistency between preceding and following statements, the ultimate value for human beings. In these 6 sandarbhas, the statements with which we introduce our explanation of the Bhagavatam verses will serve as the sūtras. Bhagavatam verses themselves will serve as the scriptural text to be analyzed, and the commentary on the verses will be the explanations of those verses given by the great Vaiṣṇava Śrīdhara Svāmī. This brings to the fore the exalted position of Śrīdhara Svāmī, which was given to him by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and which Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī is carrying forward into his Six Sandarbhas. He's saying what I'm going to introduce and the Bhāgavatam verses that I'm going to use as evidence to the ideas I'm going to introduce are going to be primarily supported by the commentaries of Śrīdhara Svāmī on the Bhagavad Purana itself. In other cases, there will be other times that I introduce other evidence, we shall base our explanations on the authoritative opinions of the Venerable Sri Ramanujacharya Bhagavad-pada, expressed in such works as Sri Bhāṣya, his commentary on the Vedānta-sūtra. We shall also proffer alternative explanations from those mentioned above as per the intrinsic intent of the original book, the Bhagavad Purana. We will also derive verification from the text itself, the Bhagavatam. We will present one idea. We will give substance to that idea, not only with the verse from the Bhagavatam, but from other similar verses and explanations presented in the text itself. He goes on, I will quote these passages to verify my own interpretations, not the statements of Śrīmad Bhāgavatam. Śrīmad Bhāgavatam is self-evident. We don't need to verify Śrīmad Bhāgavatam. It is the light, it is the scripture that provides full transcendental knowledge of spiritual revelation. So we don't need to verify it, but I'm going to give an interpretation. I'm going to give a presentation of what the Bhagavatam's saying, and that presentation I do need to verify. I do need to be able to give you, the reader of this text, ample evidence to justify the Tattva, the philosophical points that I'm presenting here. And this Tattva, when taken all together, becomes the Siddhanta of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Some of the verses quoted here I have not seen in their original text, but have gleaned from the citations of the Bhagavad Tatparya, Bharat Tatparya, Brahma Sutra Bhāṣya, and other works of the Venerable Sri Madhvacharya, the prolific teacher of the distinct Vaishnava philosophy of Tattvavad. So now we have three major contributors that Jiva Goswāmī is going to use as verification to the philosophical points that he's going to present in his Six Sandarbhas. This is important, these choices. First, of course, is a student of Sankaracharya's school, the Venerable Śrīdhara Svāmī. He took initiation in that lineage, although it's beyond any shadow of a doubt that he is a follower of Vaishnavism in the sense of a personal manifestation of the Supreme Lord being the ultimate objective of spiritual practice, as opposed to the impersonal Advaitin presentation of Brahmavad, which is also, when we come into Sankaracharya, even further from Brahmavad into what we will discuss a little later, which is called, or can be referred to as, radical non-dualism. It doesn't even fall into the spectrum of the umbrella of what is in the Vedas as a whole. I mean, we know even in the Bhagavatam, we have this verse which is key, Vedanti tattva vidas tattvam yas jnanamadvayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavan iti subjite. It's certainly accepted that the Brahman conception of the absolute truth is one way to look at that absolute non-dual substance, and certain transcendentalists look at it that way. But there's also those that go a step further, and they take an extreme understanding that doesn't embrace the other ideals or the other manifestations of the Supreme Absolute Truth, which is the Paramatma and the Bhagavan. But they say that exclusively the only idea that can be accepted is that of Brahman realization, and any other conception is simply an illusion. And that is referred to commonly as Mayavad philosophy. So we have two. We have Brahmavad and we have Mayavad. Just like we have the conception, just to put it in modern terms, which we're all somewhat familiar with, we have the contemporary conception of what is Guru Tattva and the proper chain of disciplic succession coming from one teacher to student, one by one. But then we have the radical Guru Tattva of the Ritvik interpretation that's recently come into play. And we could see how much havoc that's created, this misconception regarding Guru Tattva. So similarly, Lord Shiva, as Sankaracharya, came in and he gave his interpretation to the Veda, which was not an acceptable interpretation. It moved things in a particular direction, but that's for a much different discussion than we're having today. Jiva Goswami is going to use Śrīdhara Svāmī from that school, the same school into which Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself took sannyas. He's going to use explanations presented by the Ramanuja Sampradaya, by Ramanujacharya, and by Sri Madhvacharya. Now, we as Gaudiyas would naturally say, well, here's Jiva, here's the youngest of the Goswamis, and as his support, why isn't he taking that support primarily from his own school? But the purpose of the Six Sandarbhas is to give validity to Gaudiya Vaishnavism as presented by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. You can't give that validity by using the teachers of your own school if you want it to really stand up. And Jiva Goswami wants to stand up Gaudiya Vaishnavism beside the school of Ramanuj, the school of Madhvacharya, and the other schools of Vaishnavism that see beyond Sankaracharya's non-dualistic presentation. So what better means to capture the overall mindset of all the schools of Vaishnav thought at the time than to rely on their primary acharyas themselves? So it's a very clever thing that Jiva Goswami's doing here in establishing Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And although he did this quite well, we find that there was still necessity to conform to the norms of the other Vaishnav sects by presenting a commentary or a bhāṣya on the Vedānta-sūtra. When the Gaudiyas were requested to do this, they gave that task to Baladev Vidyabhushan. And therefore we have our Govinda Bhāṣya commentary on the Vedānta-sūtra presented by Baladev Vidyabhushan. I wanted to share with you a little bit from the commentary here. So Jiva Goswami, he plans to follow a format similar to the one Śrīla Vyāsadeva uses in the Vedānta-sūtra. The Vedānta-sūtra is divided into adhikaraṇas, topics. Each adhikaraṇa is based upon certain statements from the Upaniṣads. The Upanishadic statements are called viṣaya-vākya, the statements to be discussed. In the Sandarbhas, the introductory statements are like the sutras in the Vedānta-sūtra. The statements of Śrīmad Bhāgavatam constitute the subject to be analyzed, and Śrīla Jīva Gosvāmī's comments on the Bhāgavatam statements are like the bhāṣya on the sutras. Jīva Gosvāmī also indicates that his explanations are not his personal opinion or products of his imagination. He is going to stand them up upon the philosophical ideas put forth by the major acharyas of the other sampradayas coming before the introduction of Gaudiya Vaishnavism by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his followers. This is the methodology that he's going to employ in presenting his Sandarbhas. And now the second half of the Tattva Sandarbha, we dive into what's knowable. Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojan. Sri Jiva begins an analysis to determine from a transcognitive perspective the subject, the means, and the goal of the Bhagavat Purana, Prameya, the knowable. In doing so, he adopts a unique approach in which the subject, means, and goal are shown to be not logical propositions, but directly cognized truths from the trans-empirical states of awareness of Sri Sukha and Sri Vyāsa. In other words, this is not knowledge that one would typically gain from an outward inquiry utilizing what was at their disposal, the senses and the mind and the world around them. Rather, it's going to be based on, as we know, Śrīmad Bhāgavatam. Now, what is the Bhāgavatam itself based on? It's a samadhi bhāṣya. It is revelation coming from samadhi or coming from a state of awareness which is beyond the purview of our material mind and senses. A little bit more explanation. Jīva Gosvāmī's exposition until now has been to establish Śrīmad Bhāgavatam as his praman, understood in the sense of sabda, revelation. With this step completed, the determination of Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojan would appear to be straightforward. It must be noted, however, that if sabda is interpreted in its weaker sense as denoting nothing more than scriptural authority, it would be sufficient to cite any passage from Śrīmad Bhāgavatam that logically identifies the principles to be investigated. On that level, the scriptural argument would be directed merely at the cognitive operation of rational mind, to convince rather than to elicit direct self-transcending awareness. Such a view is relative to the state of practice promoted primarily by scriptural injunction, Vaidhi Bhakti. If we want to take this approach to Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojan, which is based on simply an investigation wherein we accept simply logical scriptural references and the logic of Scripture and base our Abhideya, our practice, simply on that logic, if that's the approach we want to take, that is the approach of Vaidhi Bhakti. There is much more to be said about the approach of Raganuga Bhakti, the approach of revelation. That goes to the heart of what really the Śrīmad Bhāgavatam has to offer. And now, in a series of Anuchedas, Jīva Gosvāmī is going to establish from the Bhāgavatam itself the fact that this book was made after the Vaidhi approach had already been fully presented. Śrīla Vyāsadeva had already taken and written down all the Vedas and presented from the Vedas and the Upaniṣadic portions of the Vedas wherein the topmost scriptural truths are presented, a Vedānta-sūtra where he took that essence and then he commented on that. Now we have a Vedānta-sūtra. And then he gave a fifth Veda, wherein the heart he gave Bhagavad Gita and the rest of the Puranas. All that was presented, and we have all the scriptural logic we need. We have all the scriptural statements we need to attest to a dharmic life that ends in our freedom from material existence. And Śrīla Vyāsadeva sits in lamentation. I am not satisfied. What did I miss? I've done all this for the benefit of human society, and I just don't feel complete. All this work, all this writing, all this has been put forward for the poor people of Kali Yuga that have a poor intelligence. And even I gave them the Mahabharata, give them another approach. Maybe there's a way that we can pull them in, because they're not allowed, even according to social convention, to study the Vedas. And because of the fallen nature of people in Kali Yuga, we've given this Mahabharata and the other Puranas to expand upon the meaning, to complete the meaning. Purana means to complete the meaning presented in the Veda, so that it's easily approached. But I sit in lamentation. I am not content. And from that state of discontent, that necessity for a deeper, more fulfilling understanding, is born the second presentation of the Bhagavatam, based upon his personal revelation. And now Jiva is going to present from the pages of the Bhagavatam itself an entranceway for us to ourselves go beyond this Vaidhi approach, this intellectual cognition based upon rationality as opposed to revelation. This is extraordinary to be able to do this at this point. This is the key to our Gaudiya Rag Marg lineage, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Golokare Premadan, Harinam Sankirtan, entering into the heart of the revelation of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu available to us through Shravanam Kirtanam, which gives to us more than just an intellectualization. It gives us an entranceway into personal revelation, where we ourselves become the experiencer, not that it's simply a religious approach to spirituality. Jiva Goswami's going to first present Sukadeva Goswami's revelation. You'd think that he'd first go into Śrīla Vyāsadeva's revelation, but he's first going to present Sukadeva's revelation, because the Bhagavatam itself gives a deeper explanation to what Śrīla Vyāsadeva experienced. So the 29th Anucheda, realization of Bhagavan supersedes that of the self. Jiva writes there, I offer my obeisances to Śrīla Vyāsadeva's son, Sri Sukha, who destroys all sins. Although his consciousness was completely filled with the bliss of self-realization, and though he had consequently cast off all other feelings and thoughts, his essence, Sara, was irresistibly drawn by the beautiful pastimes of Lord Ajita, Krishna. Out of compassion, he thus delineated this Purana with Lumen's reality. Similarly, the ultimate attainment for conscious beings, Purushartha, which is known as the stage of final completion, Prayojan Tattva, is the ecstasy of love for Krishna, which leads to the sort of spiritual attraction for him that Sri Sukha experienced. And thus our means, abhideya, too, is specifically the devotional turning of awareness and all facilities to him, bhajan, characterized by such practices as hearing his divine pastimes. Such engagement effectuates the self-manifestation of love for him as it did in the case of Sri Sukha. So here, Jiva is gradually introducing us to this idea that this Bhagavat Purana has an agenda, and that agenda is based on revelation. And that revelation is what was experienced first by the author himself, Śrīla Vyāsadeva, and then by the speaker who, upon the desire, the intent of Vyāsadeva, even though he was completely self-realized, he was an Atmarama, free of any worldly attachments, still this Bhagavatam drew even him. He'd already gone beyond everything that was offerable by material enjoyment and realized that true self-satisfaction and pleasure lies within. And he'd attained that. He was happy there. So happy that when he came out of the womb, he just walked off naked in the world, without a care, without an aspiration in worldly affairs. But still there was a desire on the part of Śrīla Vyāsadeva to enlighten him, and divine arrangements by providence were made through Vyāsadeva that his consciousness, even though completely saturated in the bliss of self-satisfaction, was drawn to these narrations of the personality of the Supreme. Now we go on. We had a couple Anuchetas to just introduce us to this drew even Sukadeva Goswami, the speaker. And how did this come about to begin with? Because it drew Śrīla Vyāsadeva, who went into trance upon the directive of his guru. Because this division deals with the samadhi of Vyas, it implicitly denotes the transcendental mode of knowing. In fact, samadhi, as outlined in the classic yoga system of Patanjali, is the precise term given to designate the supercognitive state. Thus, samadhi implies not only an additional faculty of knowing, distinct from perception and inference, but a dimension of knowing that is direct and hence undoubtable. It is not arrived at through perception of objects or the inferences drawn from them. Neither is it mediated through cognitions. It is unmediated knowing, or knowing through identity. Whatever is disclosed in that state is known not in the way of conceptual understanding, but as direct feeling awareness of, or identity with, what is known. So, as in the case of Sri Sukha, Sri Vyasa's apprehension of Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojan was a self-disclosure of consciousness itself from the trans-empirical dimension, beyond the senses, of knowing. The elaboration of these principles, self-manifested to Vyas, is the subject of extended analysis in the following division. Now, this division of the Tattva Sandarbha is going to unpack that section of the Bhagavat Purana, the Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, wherein Vyas has this transcendental revelation of the Supreme in samadhi, just so that we understand the significance of the revelation and its influence upon Vyasadeva, and to foster in us a desire for that kind of revelation beyond simply armchair acquisition of knowledge, which will simply lead to a spiritual practice which is based on principles that are centered around basically our material existence. The Vaidhi approach. There's the Vaidhi approach, and there's the approach of the Raganuga Bhakti. He wants to taste spiritual revelation. That's what we as Gaudiyas aspire to. Our approach begins at Vaidhi, but it ends in Raganuga. And that beginning in Vaidhi gives us a firm groundwork where a little knowledge and a little detachment firmly set us in our spiritual practice. Sri Jiva continues in his Sandarbhas, Anuchena 30, prior to the writing of Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, the ultimate truth that it intends to elucidate was directly experienced by Vyasadeva in this state of samadhi, as expressed in the following verses. And now he quotes directly in his Anucheta primary verses from the Bhagavat Purana explaining the samadhi of Śrīla Vyāsadeva. And of course, the writing that's being spoken of here in this Anucheta is the second presentation of the Śrīmad Bhāgavatam. So as we know, there was a first presentation of the Bhagavat Purana along with all the other Puranas, Itihasas, and the Mahabharata in support of the Vedas and the Vedānta-sūtra that Śrīla Vyāsadeva had presented to human society. And then he went back and rewrote the Śrīmad Bhāgavatam in light of the essence of attainment of the topmost ideal of spirituality, which is unmitigated love for the Supreme. In his pure heart, which was established in perfect fixity through the yoga of unalloyed devotion, he saw the original complete person, Purusham Purnam, along with his extrinsic potency, Maya, which was apart from and yet supported by him. In trance, we're talking about the trance of samadhi, Vyasadeva saw that complete person. He had personal darshan of the Supreme Lord. And he also, in that darshan, he saw his potencies, his various shaktis. He also saw one of those primary shaktis being the shakti of the Lord's external material energy, the Maya Shakti. The Bhagavatam goes on, bewildered by this extrinsic potency, the individual self, although transcendental to the three gunas of primordial nature, thinks of itself as consisting of the three gunas, and thus undergoes the miseries resulting from this identification. Śrīla Vyāsadeva also saw that the yoga of unalloyed devotion to Bhagavan, who is beyond sense perception, is the direct means to extinguish this misery. Knowing all this, the wise Vyasadeva composed this Sattvata Samhita, Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, for the people in general who are unaware of this fact. Indeed, in the very act of receptively and attentively hearing this Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, bhakti to Sri Krishna, the Supreme Person, self-manifests in a person's heart, dispelling lamentation, illusion, and fear. Bhakti here refers to devotion in its completional stage as prema. After composing and revising Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, Śrīla Vyāsadeva taught it to his son, the great sage Sri Sukadeva Goswāmī, who delighted in the state of utter non-attachment. So in the Bhāgavatam, we have this very profound presentation of the samadhi of Śrīla Vyāsadeva, and the result of that samadhi is the Bhagavat Purana itself. And what is the characteristic that's being brought out here from the 7th chapter of the 1st canto? Simply by receptively hearing about this bhakti to Sri Krishna that's presented in the Bhagavatam, bhakti self-manifests in the heart of the listener, dispelling all lamentation, illusion, and fear. The Sabda Brahman that is the Śrīmad Bhāgavatam itself melts away the material existence of the conditioned Bada Jiva. Jiva Gosvāmī continues, when it is said that Sri Vyas saw the original complete person, it should be self-evident that he saw him as being self-endowed with his own intrinsic potency, Swarup Shakti. Just as when it is said that a person sees the full moon, the implication is that he sees it accompanied by its effulgence. In other words, Śrīla Vyāsadeva's revelation was comprehensive. He saw Krishna. He saw the Lord's unlimited potencies. And he also saw one of those potencies being his deluding energy, which is influencing another of his potencies, the Jiva Shakti. And he saw the solution to that illusion state of suffering, and that he presented in the Bhagavatam itself. The Bhagavatam itself was the solution. He goes on in that 31st Anucheta, and please know that what I'm presenting here is just small snippets that I've taken from the whole text, but I've just pulled out a little of the essence to give you a taste and hopefully develop in you a thirst for a more comprehensive study on your own part of the Sandarbhas of Jiva Gosvāmī. This understanding through the lens or the bhāṣya of Śrīmad Bhāgavatam presented by Jiva Gosvāmī is going to give us the most comprehensive understanding of Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojan available so that our practice can be fully nourished. There's so much there in Bhagavatam, but it has been unpacked here to a major extent by pulling out its essence, which is what the word Sandarbha itself means, and presenting it systematically. Here is the Sambandha, here is the Abhideya, here is the Prayojan. It has also been unpacked in very specific ways in the literature of the other Goswamis. So all of them have made a very concerted effort, and all those efforts based upon what is available to us in the Śrīmad Bhāgavatam. And prior to the advent of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, although the Bhagavatam had been there for 45 centuries, it is not until Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's advent and the extensive unpacking of the Śrīmad Bhāgavatam that these revelations are fully comprehended in Vaishnava society, and a new sampradaya is created based upon these revelations. Śrīla Vyāsadeva set the groundwork, he planted the seed, and it took 4,500 years for it to fully mature and come out in a way that could be fully implemented by people seeking complete revelation in spirituality. Prior to this, the Purushartha was not prema or unmitigated love for the Supreme Lord, but it was rather freedom from the miseries of material existence and in liberation, either to merge into the Lord at the bottom of the scale all the way to associating with him, Salokya, Samipya, Sarsti, Swarupya, having a similar form. So we'll go on here. It is to be noted in the verse beginning, he saw the original complete person. There is no separate mention of Paramatma, Bhagavan's plenary portion who oversees Maya, or of Brahman, Bhagavan's non-differentiated aspect. The reason for this omission is that Paramatma and Brahman were seen to exist within the original complete person, Purna Purusha, and not separately. A fact we will thoroughly demonstrate later in the second and third Sandarbhas. Thus, here, as before, the Sambandhi Tattva, or the essential topic of discussion in Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, has been identified. Again, remember, this was all attained in samadhi, and in samadhi, this was revelation, a self-identification, something that's hard for us to conceive of that because the methodology that we have had to utilize due to the limitations of our material body and the use of the material body to acquire knowledge on our part has all been based on utilization of the senses filtered through the mind, and then taking what has been experienced either directly through our own senses or been relayed to us through others of their experience. We've arrived at conclusions which we have accepted as this is the logical conclusion that I can accept. Imagine being overwhelmed in trance with revelation of the Supreme Lord. It's so overwhelming that just as Brahma experienced in the Brahma Vimohan Leela, he couldn't even comprehend what this Krishna, who I can see now, he was my guru at the beginning, and now what's happening? He's now becoming all these Vishnus, and overwhelming how to even approach this kind of understanding. We'll finish up. The method Abhideya that facilitates ultimate attainment and the stage of completion to be attained, prayojan, as we have defined them, are based on the essential distinction between the Supreme Self and the individual self. It is precisely this inherent capacity of the living being to be conscious that refutes the contrary opinion that the jiva exists only as an upadi of Brahman, and that liberation is simply the elimination of this upadi. As we go forward, what Jiva is going to do is, although he didn't give us, he gave us a Paramatma, he gave us a Bhagavat Sandarbha, he gave us a Paramatma Sandarbha, but what about Brahmeti? There's three different conceptions of that supreme non-dual absolute substance. Brahmeti, Paramatmeti, Bhagavaniti Sabjate. Where's our Brahman Sandarbha? He didn't write one. What's there to be said about it? There's a little bit to be said. When we continue in our next discussion, we'll go over in the Tattva Sandarbha, Anuchetas, where he presents preliminary information on how not to understand Brahman, and in that we can see the proper conception by him presenting what is not proper. With that, I will conclude this presentation today. Give you my sincerest thanks. Vanchakapatubhischa kripasiddabevacha patitadam pavanevyo Vaiṣṇava namo namaha. Thank you very much for your association.
Krishna Kirtana Ganana Tanapano Premamritam Manidhi Dhira Dhira Jana Priyau Priyakara